Of all the serial killers we are going to look at in our Murderous Minds series, Andrei Chikatilo was, in our opinion, by far the worst. He was an intelligent man, but was chronically shy with low self-esteem and depressive tendencies, whose sexual inadequacies drove him to conjure up sadistic fantasies in his mind that he couldn't suppress. In a reign of terror that lasted 12 years, he acted on these cravings in the most depraved and heinous way. As a schoolteacher, he used his position to prey on and abuse the most vulnerable people in society: children. If this wasn't bad enough, he took pleasure in torturing his victims for his own sexual release. Chikatilo became known as the Rostov Ripper, and mainly due to the mistakes made by the police at the time, he was able to kill at least 56 children and young adults, both male and female. With today's modern forensics and policing, he would probably have been caught even before he killed his first victim. But sadly, in what became known as one of the biggest police blunders ever, Chikatilo was able to evade capture and subject over 50 innocent people to the grimmest deaths imaginable. This is the horrific story of a man many argue must have been mentally imbalanced to do what he did to another human being. But as you'll see, all the murders he committed were premeditated, and at times he was devious in the victims he chose. So was he mad, or just plain evil? On October the 16th, 1936, a boy was born. He was named Andrei Chikatilo. His parents were both collective farm labourers who lived in a village in rural Ukraine, a territory of the former Soviet Union. Times were hard, and Ukraine was in the grip of mass famine, caused by Joseph Stalin's forced collectivization of agriculture. However, the family worked hard and were no different to other families born into that regime. Although there is little doubt that from a young age, Andrei would have experienced hardship and deprivation, and food would have been scarce. With the family often having to eat leaves and grass, Andrei appeared to have a normal relationship with his parents, and despite the hardship, there were no obvious problems early on. But things were about to change, when in the early hours of June the 22nd, 1941, Hitler's army smashed their tanks into the Soviet Union. And like millions of other men at the time, Andrei's father, Roman, was called up to fight in the Red Army. Roman was injured and captured almost immediately, and spent the rest of the war as a prisoner. With the Nazis now occupying Ukraine, Andrei was exposed to the horrors of war. He witnessed bombings, shootings, and fires. During this period, he and his mother shared a single bed, but he was a chronic bedwetter, and it's alleged his mother scolded and beat him regularly for his accidents. It was also around this time that his mother told him a story that would stay with him for the rest of his life, and was maybe the catalyst for the heinous crimes he would later commit. She told him that in 1934 his cousin had disappeared from the village, apparently kidnapped, and such was the level of hunger at the time that it was rumoured he was eaten by the locals. This gruesome story, told to 5-year-old Andrei, made a profound impact on his young mind. He was both horrified and fascinated. Later in life, he would attempt to reenact that act of cannibalism. In 1943, Andrei's mother gave birth to his half-sister. She was called Tatiana. The child's father is unknown, as Roman was a prisoner of war at the time of her conception, although it's widely believed she was the result of a rape, possibly by a German soldier, an attack that could well have been witnessed by young Andrei. A year after Tatiana's birth, Andrei started school, but right from the start he never fitted in, and was remembered as a shy, withdrawn child who failed to make friends and who was very secretive. At this time, he was still wetting the bed. Something else he kept to himself was the fact he couldn't see properly. His chronic short-sightedness meant he couldn't read the board properly in lessons. But instead of telling his teachers, he suffered in silence due to fear of being teased if he had to wear glasses. Incredibly, Andrei did not get his first pair of glasses until he was 30 years old. In 1945, Roman Chikatilo was liberated from a concentration camp and returned home. But unlike some of his neighbours, Andrei's father was not welcome home to hero. His capture meant he was considered a coward, and to his son, he brought shame on the family. Andrei would now have to endure the relentless bullying by his classmates over his father's failure to fight for his country. This, along with the constant ridicule over his physical appearance, his eyesight, and homemade clothing, made his early school days difficult. Despite this, academically he was a good student, and excelled in reading, and had an extraordinary ability to remember things. But worse was to come as adolescence kicked in. Andrei only had to sit near a female and he would start blushing. This inability to be normal saw Andrei isolated and mocked, and he retreated more and more into his books and the fantasy world he was building within him. However, despite his shortcomings, Andrei was not an ugly boy. He was growing into a strong, well-built man, and by his teens, he was a model student, graduating with excellent grades in 1954. It was this same year that Andrei found himself home alone when the doorbell rang. It was 13-year-old Tanya Bala, a friend of his sister's. As the girl stood there, Andrei looked her up and down, and his sexual urges got the better of him. He pushed the young girl to the ground, and the pair just lay there pressed together tightly. Although nothing physical happened between them, this was Andrei's first sexual encounter. Afterwards, he felt completely ashamed and vowed to stay pure until he married. Over the next few years, Andrei concentrated on bettering himself and devoted most of his time to his studies, and set his sights on Moscow University. So he travelled to Moscow to take the entrance exams. However, his family was so poor that he slept in a railway station during this period. But his dreams of a permanent move to Moscow were shattered when he learned he had not been accepted into university. Andrei was convinced his rejection was due to his father's shameful effort in the war, and developed a deep hatred for him. The reality was that places at Moscow State University were much sought after. After failure to secure a place at his dream university, he lowered his expectations and signed up to the local technical college for a course in communications engineering. It was during this time that he had his first real love affair. Again, it was with one of his sister's friends, but the relationship lasted less than 2 months. In 1955, Chikatilo relocated to the Ural city of Nizhny Tagil to work on a long-term construction project. Again, although his work colleagues liked him, he was dogged by his inability to sustain relationships with girls. And just like his school days, lived in fear of being ridiculed and mocked. In 1957, he was called up for military service, where he was drafted into the communications unit. His time in the army was not happy. He failed to mix and became somewhat of a loner, choosing not to go out in the evening and meet girls like his fellow soldiers. Again, for fear his inadequacies would be exposed. He spent his evenings alone in the barracks, listening to the radio and studying politics. And to his horror, some of his colleagues thought he was gay. When his service was complete, Andrei moved back to the family home. But he didn't stay long. He was now 24 years old and had ambitions. So he decided to move a few hundred miles away, across the border into Russia. He quickly found a job as a telephone engineer in a small town around 20 miles north of Rostov. Things worked out well for Andrei, and for the first time, he had his own place with running water, electricity, and an indoor toilet. A little over a year later, Andrei persuaded his family to move, and they all lived together in his tiny one-bed place. although it wasn't long until they got their own place and settled down in their new home, and his sister Tatiana met a local man and married. But for Andrei, his chronic shyness was preventing him from forming any meaningful relationships. His sister was getting concerned that her brother was not married. He was 27 and seemed no closer to finding a lasting relationship, despite his sister's matchmaking efforts. But in 1963, she hooked him up with a girl named Fenya. She was tall and intelligent, and Andrei liked her. Although on their first meeting, Andrei's crippling shyness got the better of him, and he couldn't even look her in the eye and was barely able to tell her his name. Despite this awkward first meeting, Tatiana persisted, and on subsequent meetings, the pair warmed to each other, and Fenya thought him ideal marriage material. After all, he wasn't like other men of her age. He didn't drink much, didn't womanize, had good job prospects, and totally respected her. Little did she know what she was letting herself in for. In 1963, the pair married at a local registry office. But on their first night as a married couple, Fenya realized her new husband had real problems, and the marriage was not consummated. Although the issue was never fully resolved, Fenya did manage to get pregnant, and she gave birth to a baby girl in 1967. 2 years later, they also had a son. To the outside world, they appeared to have the perfect married life. And Andrei was ambitious and keen to better himself, so decided to study for a degree in Russian language and literature at Rostov University. Andrei was a good father and doted on his children. But this fantasy world was festering in his head. He was dominated by his wife and felt little attraction to her, and he was sinking into depression. The thoughts in his head were getting out of control. He longed to have a normal relationship, but had no one to turn to for help. After all, this was in the 1970s, and these sorts of things were not openly discussed. Therefore, the monstrous thoughts continued to well in his brain. But no one could have known just how twisted and heinous they would become. In 1971, all the study paid off, and Andrei gained degrees in Russian literature, engineering, and Marxism-Leninism. Despite the behind-closed-door problems in his marriage, Fenya was extremely proud. She could now boast that she was married to an educated man, and to the outside world, the family were on the up. Now armed with some good qualifications, Andrei secured a job as a Russian teacher at a school in Rostov. It was hardly the most inspiring place to live. In fact, with its poor housing and low standard of living, it was quite depressing. Nevertheless, the family made the best of it, and were better off than many at that time. Andrei was a hopeless teacher. He was shy and uninspiring, and had absolutely no control over the children he taught. They constantly ridiculed him, and even his fellow teachers teased him. But even worse was that Andrei was developing an unhealthy interest in the children he taught. In particular, he was becoming sexually attracted to the girls. In class, he would start to sit a little too close to some of his pupils, making them feel uncomfortable. He also started walking in unannounced to the girls' dormitories. This was just the start, and as the years went on, Andrei would be unable to suppress his vile thoughts, and started acting on them. Remarkably, despite him openly acting inappropriate around his pupils, and even molesting children, it was 3 years before the school finally asked him to resign, which he promptly did. Inexplicably, his work references made no mention of this heinous behaviour. It was a time where these things were not talked about. It's alleged even Fenya knew of her husband's sexual interest in children, but passed it off as a joke. Little did any of these people know what was to come, and how speaking out could have saved countless lives. However, nobody said a word. Andrei found another teaching job just around the corner, but this time the pupils were older, and Andrei had little opportunity to act on his fantasies. Again, as a teacher, he was a disaster, and when cutbacks were made in 1978, he was the first to be made redundant. Again, he found another job as a sort of warden at another school in the nearby town of Shakhty. This job came with an apartment, and Fenya was also given a position as a matron. The college was for young men between the age of 15 and 19, and although he did a little teaching, his main role was to supervise the pupils in their hostel in the evening. As with the other jobs, few of the pupils or staff liked him or respected him, and the boys run riot whenever he was on duty. But far more serious was that Andre sexually assaulted one of the boys as he slept. Again, something that was hushed up and not reported to the authorities. Shortly after moving to Shakti, unbeknown to his family, Andre purchased a small one-room house in the slum area of the town. This was a premeditated attempt by Andre to build a secret life away from the family home, where he could indulge in his unnatural desires away from prying eyes. Andre would lure men and women back to the house with promises of money or food, in return for sexual favours. He chose mostly prostitutes and down-and-outs, but also attempted to lure children. However, more often than not, they would run home to their parents. On December the 22nd, 1978, Chikatilo snared his first victim. She was 9-year-old Lena Zakotnova. Lenya was walking home after staying later than expected at a friend's house. Chikatilo, who was prowling the streets, started talking to the little girl, and after she told him she needed the toilet, he invited her back to his place. No sooner had she got through the door, he struck. He sexually assaulted the girl and stabbed her in a frenzied attack, before dumping her body into the Grushovka River. He then calmly went back to his family home and cleaned himself up. Lena's body was washed up 2 days later. This was to be the start of Chikatilo's killing spree. He was excited by the struggle and dominance over his victim, and also the sight of her blood. The deadly thrill he got from killing Lena meant it was inevitable he would do it again. What was astonishing though was at the same time, as with his molestation of school pupils, there was a chance he could have been stopped. People living near his home tipped off the police about the strange man that visited there, but never stayed the night, and who they believed used the home as some sort of squalid love nest. They also noted that on the night of Lena's disappearance, the light in the house was left on all night. Incredibly, Chikatilo was questioned at least 8 times about Lena's murder, and his past during his teaching years was exposed. However, Fenya provided a cast iron alibi and said that he was at home all night, even though she herself was in work. The police seemed to accept this, despite there being strong evidence pointing to Chikatilo, and instead, he was eliminated from their inquiries, and a local man, who had previously been convicted of a similar offence, and who allegedly confessed to the crime, was charged, convicted, and sentenced to death. He was executed by firing squad 4 years later. For Chikatilo, the cloud of suspicion now hung over him, and it didn't go unnoticed by his employers, as soon after they asked him to resign due to cutbacks, and he again found himself looking for a job. This time he chose to stay away from teaching, and in a move that must have disappointed his wife, he took a lowly job as a supply clerk at the Rostov local industrial complex in Shakti. The job did come with an apartment that the family moved into, and although this was a significant come down, he was better suited for this type of work, as he was alone most of the time, and his position involved frequent travelling, meaning sometimes he'd be away for days at a time. This gave him the perfect environment to plan his next murder. Although, having been unnerved by the police interviews and suspicion surrounding his first murder, he waited 3 years before he struck again. The unfortunate victim was a 17-year-old young lady that Chikatilo picked up in the middle of Rostov city while on one of his business trips. At first, she willingly went with the much older stranger in the hope of food, drink, and a good time. But as they walked along the path together, Chikatilo snapped and led her into a wooded area, where he brutally attacked her. As she struggled, he strangled her and mutilated her lifeless body. This frenzied killing had given Chikatilo a feeling that he hadn't experienced before. This is what he had been looking for all his life. The young girl's partially covered body was found the next day. Chikatilo did not kill again for another 9 months, but starting in June of the following year, he went on a frantic killing spree. On June the 12th, 1982, a 13-year-old was running errands for her mother. But unfortunately for her, en route, she met Chikatilo, who was on another one of his business trips. Again, the heinous desire took over, and he launched a wild attack, stabbing at her body and eyes, before partially covering her corpse and leaving it to decompose in the warm summer conditions. When it was discovered 2 weeks later, it was skeletal. Over the course of the next 6 months, Chikatilo kills another 6 youngsters. In July, a 14-year-old, followed by 2 murders in August, when he killed 9-year-old Oleg Pozdravev and 16-year-old Olga Koeprina. Then in September, there was a change. Instead of females, he targeted 2 young boys, 9-year-old Ira Kalnaberikova and 15-year-old Sergej Koezmin. The last known killing of that year was a 10-year-old girl named Olga Stalmatsjenok. By this time, Chikatilo was out of control. He wasn't satisfied with just killing his victims. He wanted to inflict as much terror as he could, and most of his victims had over 30 stab wounds and horrifically mutilated bodies, usually on their stomachs and genitals. And in what became a trademark of his, he stabbed at their eyes, as if this would let them unsee what he was doing to them. This very rare and vile trait meant even though Chikatilo chose his victims hundreds of miles apart, police were eventually able to establish a link. In 1983, Chikatilo killed a further 8 children and young adults. By now, he was choosing his victims carefully and would often pick on prostitutes, alcoholics, or the homeless, with the promise of money or food in return for sex. He wasn't fussy whether they were male or female. If the opportunity arose, he would take it. Often his victims went willingly with him to secluded areas, and because his older victims had often dropped out of regular society, they were not reported missing and only became known when their bodies were found. By the end of 1983, the number of known victims was 17, and the Central Moscow militia, concerned by the number of dead children that were being reported by local police, sent Major Mikhail Fetisov and his team to Rostov to take over the investigation that was called Forest Path. It was Fetisov that suggested that the murders were the work of a single sex-craved male. However, incredibly, at the police headquarters in Moscow, they still refused to admit there was a sex-craved serial killer on the loose. After all, this was 1980s Russia, and that could not possibly be the case. It was now 1984, and Chikatilo's personal and work life was out of control. By now, his work colleagues virtually ignored him, and his bosses were concerned at his work ethic and the amount of time he was absent. His home life was chaotic. His obsession with searching for the next victim meant he was hardly ever there. And although, to the outside world, his marriage appeared happy behind closed doors was a different story. His obsession with seeking out his next victim had taken over, and he would spend more and more of his time in different communities, trying to infiltrate them and prey on his next victim. In January of the new year, Chikatilo killed a 17-year-old girl in Rostov's Aviators Park. Less than a month later, in the same park, he murdered a 44-year-old woman. Both women had fallen on hard times and were finding solace in alcohol and prostitution. Both bodies were found in a horrific state, stabbed and mutilated. But just as before, an innocent man called Borowski was arrested and charged with the 2 murders, again taking the focus off the real killer. Around the same time, Chikatilo was accused of stealing from his employers, and charges were brought against him. So yet again, he found himself out of work and searching for a job. But in his mind, he had a job, and that was to kill as many people as he could. On the 24th of March, he lured a 10-year-old boy to his death. On this occasion, he was seen by several witnesses who were able to give investigators a detailed description of the killer. When the boy's body was found 3 days later, police also found a footprint, and recovered bodily fluids from the victim's clothing. With that, they were able to establish the murderer's blood type was AB. But this was a fatal mistake. What was not realised at the time was that Chikatilo's blood type was actually type A, as he was one of a minority of people known as non-secretors, whose blood type cannot be identified by anything other than a blood sample. This left Chikatilo free to carry on, and in the following 6 months, he killed an astonishing 12 more people, including a double murder on May the 25th, when he killed Tatiana Petrosyan and her 11-year-old daughter, Sveta. Chikatilo had known Tatiana for many years, and she was a former love interest. This double murder was followed, in June, by the killing of a 22-year-old lady. Then in July, he killed a further 3 victims, including a 13-year-old boy and 2 young women. At the beginning of August, he found another job in a factory in Rostov, where he was head of a department. But yet again, he was ridiculed by his colleagues and was hopeless at the job. The day after starting, he killed a 16-year-old girl, quickly followed by a 17-year-old. On August the 8th, Chikatilo boarded a plane to the capital of Uzbekistan, where he stayed for a week on a business trip. One of the first things he did after landing was purchase a knife. During his time there, he killed an unidentified woman who was later found decapitated. And then on August the 13th, he killed a 12-year-old girl who had run away from her home. When he returned to Rostov, he killed an 11-year-old boy in a frenzied attack. He castrated the poor boy and gouged his eyes out, leaving his body just yards from where he had left a previous victim. Less than 2 weeks later, he killed another 24-year-old. By this time, the police were desperate to get their killer, and with the major back on the case, every expert available analysed the clothing and clues, and was sure they were looking for a man with blood type AB. When Chikatilo was arrested on September the 14th, 1984, and his blood was tested as type A, he was effectively eliminated from their investigations, even though everything else pointed to him being involved. All his history of previous abuse was revealed, and unlike before, people were starting to talk about his weird stalking habits. Eventually, in an attempt to hold Chikatilo longer, he was charged and convicted of the theft from his former employers, and sentenced to 1 year's imprisonment, and expelled from the Communist Party. Incredibly, he was released after just 3 months, and on December the 12th, 1984, was free to kill again. For Chikatilo, this was a fresh start. After all, he had been eliminated from any involvement in his murders, so now the slate was clean. He blamed his imprisonment on his previous employers wrongfully accusing him of stealing. In a show of solidarity, Chikatilo returned to his family home and celebrated New Year with his wife and children. Shortly after, he found employment as an engineer at a nearby locomotive factory. Again, this was a bit of a downgrade, but considering he had a criminal record, it was better than nothing. During this time, he did not commit one murder. But eventually, the urge got too much. It had been just under a year since his last killing, and when he was sent on a business trip to Moscow, Chikatilo took the opportunity to resume his killing. He killed an 18-year-old, but unbeknown to him, he was not the only one in Moscow. The major had also returned there, and after viewing the body, he was sure the same person was responsible. On his return home, Chikatilo killed an 18-year-old girl. These latest killings spurred the authorities into action. Enough was enough, this man had to be caught. So alongside the major, one of Russia's top detectives was put in charge of the Forest Path investigation. With all the publicity surrounding this appointment, Chikatilo would have been well aware of the beefed-up inquiry, and in a calculated move, he chose not to kill again for another 2 years. During this period, he was promoted in work, not because he was good at his job, but because no one else wanted to take on the task. He also secured a job for his daughter, who was now married with a child, although she didn't stay long after her marriage broke up. In 1987, Chikatilo needed to kill again. He knew about the coverage by investigators. So when on May the 16th, he was sent on a business trip to the town of Revda in the Urals mountains, he murdered a 13-year-old boy. The killings had resumed and were becoming more and more vile and sadistic. On July the 29th, 1987, on a trip to Ukraine, Chikatilo killed a 12-year-old boy. The attack was so brutal that part of his knife blade had broken off and was later found at the scene by police. On September the 15th, 1987, in Leningrad, Chikatilo killed another boy. He was just 16 years old. In the 2 years that followed, he killed and mutilated 9 more victims, most of which were children, and in a desperate attempt to dispose of the bodies, as well as horrifically mutilate them, he started cutting some of them up so he could wrap them and carry them easier. When police recovered the bodies, many of them had body parts removed. The females were missing their uterus and nipples, and the males had genitals and occasionally tongues sliced or bitten off. 1990 was to be Chikatilo's last year of freedom. It also saw him again start a new job and a new reign of terror, in which he killed a further 8 young adults and children. His final victim was a 22-year-old, who he befriended at a train station on November the 6th. She willingly went with him to the woods near the station, where she was beaten, stabbed, and mutilated. He then removed her tongue and her nipples to eat them. On November the 20th, 1990, Chikatilo was now under heavy surveillance, as the police finally realized he was the killer. He attempted to talk to a young boy, but was scared off when a woman spotted him. But he was not done, and tried to engage with another young boy, who was called back by his mother. As Chikatilo walked away, 3 men approached him and identified themselves as police officers. He was arrested and handcuffed. He did not attempt to resist. When police searched his briefcase, they found a knife, a length of rope, and a pocket mirror. The game was finally up. On the journey to the police station, Chikatilo remained completely silent. He was also less than willing to provide answers when questioned by investigators, although at no point did he protest his innocence. A breakthrough came when Chikatilo was interviewed by a psychiatrist. The 2 men hit it off and talked in great detail about his life and his victims. It was at this point, after he admitted to killing his first victim, that Chikatilo was told another man had been executed for that crime, something he wasn't previously aware of. Over the next few weeks, he admitted to killing 56 people. He even pinpointed to the police the areas where he had hidden undiscovered bodies, and described how after cutting out certain body parts from his dead victims, he would often put them in his mouth and occasionally eat them, although more often than not just chew them before spitting them out. The extraordinary accuracy in which he described the killings built a clear and conclusive case against him. However, there was one more thing that had to be established, and that was whether Chikatilo was insane. The verdict was unanimous. In the opinion of the experts, Chikatilo was perfectly sane and rational when he committed his crimes. They did, however, discover he had slight lesions on his brain, which may have indicated prenatal brain damage. Chikatilo was charged with 53 murders and found guilty of 52 of them, after one charge was dropped due to insufficient evidence. However, he actually confessed to 56. On April the 14th, 1992, he went to court and was greeted by an angry crowd of photographers, victims' relatives, and the general public, all trying to catch a glimpse of the man who had terrorized their communities for so many years. In court, Chikatilo was held in an iron cage to keep him apart from his victims' families. During the proceedings, he was erratic, often shouting and changing his plea. And on more than one occasion, he dropped his trousers and waved his genitals at the assembled crowd, a far cry from the once shy man. But his guilt was a foregone conclusion, and on October the 15th, 1992, Chikatilo was found guilty of 52 of the 53 murder charges, and sentenced to death for each of the killings. On February the 14th, he was taken from his death row cell in prison and led into a soundproof room, where a specially selected soldier from the Interior Ministry troops walked behind him and fired a single shot to the back of his head. Andrei Chikatilo was finally dead.